Welcome. We're glad that you could join us today, both those of you in our relatively small audience and those of you who are joining us via Zoom, as we initiate a series of webcasts to highlight the work of the Presbyterian Heritage Center. Our first two installments will explore aspects of our newest exhibit on Presbyterian missionaries and Native Americans. As we know, European explorers made their way to what they termed the New World in the 16th century, searching for a passage to the Far East, searching for great riches. The Spanish and the French brought with them the Catholic faith. While many did not settle in one place for long, others established trading posts and missions. The English came a bit later with Protestant Christianity. Propagation of the faith had begun. The arrival of the English, beginning in 1607, brought people who sought to replicate their society in this strange new land, rather than simply extract resources. They believed that it was their duty not only to Christianize the people that they encountered, but also to civilize them. Civilization, of course, meant adopting a Western lifestyle, complete with a sense of property that was unknown to Native Americans. And the English settlers assumed, of course, that the Native Americans would recognize the virtue of Western ways. This was a major misassumption. So as settlements expanded, plowed fields, fenced barriers, created a problem for the more nomadic lifestyle of many of the Native Americans who did not necessarily appreciate the value of planted crops and herded animals. The stage for the clash of cultures had begun. The Heritage Center exhibit begins with the earliest colonial missionaries in New England, the Mid-Atlantic region, and Georgia. They were spurred on by the Great Awakening of the mid-18th century, somewhat disrupted by the American Revolution, and re-energized by the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century. They were with the Cherokee and the Choctaw on the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. They experienced the hardships on the Oregon Trail also in the 1830s. They were with the Dakota from Minnesota to the northern Central Plains following the Dakota War of 1862. They established missions in the American Southwest in the late 19th century. And as we shall see, they were more impactful than we might think. And much of their legacy remains today in modern churches that can trace their roots to this era, as well as institutions that have evolved from these early missions. Today, we're going to focus on the Presbyterian missionaries who began their work principally among the Cherokee and the Choctaw. Independence for the United States, the Louisiana Purchase, generated great excitement not only for the westward movement of people, but also a new spirit of revivalism. The Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century spawned a number of missionary societies. They were bent on spreading the gospel, not only to people who had moved to the frontier, but also to the Native Americans. And one of the most important of these was the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. It was founded in 1810 by Presbyterians and Congregationalists, and you're going to hear about this organization a lot in the next 20 minutes or so because it was heavily supportive of the missionaries about whom we will speak. So off go the missionaries. One of the earliest was Gideon Blackburn. He began the first Presbyterian mission to the Cherokee in 1804. Now, Blackburn was an interesting and complex individual. He had served intermittently as a chaplain with the Tennessee militia. He then moved to Maryville, Tennessee. He established a farm. He established a church. and he established a distillery, which was both perfectly legal and respectable at the time, because honestly, not too many frontier pastors could make a living being a minister. Now, he claimed that his time with the militia showed him the plight of the Native Americans and it compelled him to become a missionary. But probably just as important was the evangelical spirit of the era. Now, he obtained permission and $200 from the Presbyterian General Assembly to establish a mission among the Cherokee. Now, he was quite the entrepreneur, so he raised another $730 on his own, and he had a meeting with then President Thomas Jefferson to secure federal funding. Oh, wait a minute. Federal funding, church. What about separation and state? Well, keep that in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back to federal funding for the missionaries. Blackburn established 2 schools as a part of his mission, both near Fort Tellico, which today is near Charlestown, Tennessee. Now, as with similar missions, the idea was not only to spread Christianity, but also to provide education and to civilize the Native Americans. Now, as we shall see, Blackburn had his finger in many pies. While still in Maryville, he had met a slave named Jack, who had converted to Christianity and was preaching among the slaves in the area. Blackburn recognized potential with Jack. He taught him not only theology, but other subjects as well. He actually purchased Jack and then freed him in 1806. That is when Jack became John Gloucester. The local presbytery took him under its wing. He attended Greenville College, which is now Tusculum College, the first African American to do so. In 1807, Blackburn was traveling to Philadelphia and took John with him. And while Blackburn was in meetings, quite possibly with representatives from the Missionary Society, Gloucester was preaching to blacks in Philadelphia. When Blackburn left, Gloucester remained, and with help he was able to establish in Philadelphia the first African Presbyterian church. He was eventually able to secure the freedom of his wife and his children, and although he died fairly early in 1822, he did live long enough to see all 4 of his sons become Presbyterian ministers. With Blackburn, then, you get a sense of the complexity of these missionaries. Farmer, preacher, educator, entrepreneur. Their concern and outreach was in many cases far greater than we know. Then there was another side to Blackburn. He also generated a bit of controversy. In 1809, there was an incident, many newspapers, referencing Parson Blackburn's whiskey. Now, it seems that a shipment of whiskey from his distillery was tied up on the Cherokee side of the Conasauga River. The Conasauga River ran from eastern Tennessee down through eastern Georgia all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. If you think about it, that would be a much better river highway to get produce from eastern Tennessee and eastern Georgia than having to ship it across the Tennessee River to the Mississippi River and down to New Orleans. Okay. Well, at any rate, here was Parson Blackburn's whiskey tied up on the Cherokee side of the river. Now, the Creeks claimed that Blackburn was selling whiskey to the Cherokee, and so they confiscated it. The legal right that they had to confiscate this is a bit in question. Blackburn's agent, who was his brother, meanwhile claimed that the shipment was just waiting for Creek approval to pass through their territory before heading on down to the Gulf. Whether or not such transit was legal is also questionable. Now, based on available documentation, it would seem that Blackburn was probably working with then Governor of Tennessee, Willie Blount, in an effort to secure the right of passage down the Conasauga River to the Gulf of Mexico. It wasn't just about whiskey, but the whiskey is what happened to be there. Now, before the end of this saga, it came to involve Moravian missionaries who wanted to cast aspersions on Blackburn because of his fairly successful mission, and dueling Indian agents and a lot of forged documents. Now, this matter was forwarded to the Secretary of War, and he did absolutely nothing about it. It was, however, a bit disgraceful for Blackburn himself, particularly in that region. And so he closed his schools by 1810, and we find Blackburn moving to Franklin, Tennessee. His career, however, was not over. Let's face it, this is not the era back then of modern media. He became headmaster of a school in Franklin, Tennessee. Before his career ended, he had moved on to Kentucky and then in Illinois, founding schools in both states. And what is really interesting, at the end of his career, he came to support the temperance movement. Meanwhile, the issue of transit down the Conasauga River was settled by the Creek War just a few years later, when the federal government took control. Now, not all missionaries to Native Americans were quite this colorful, although many of them were just as complex, some controversial in their own ways. Enter Cyrus Kingsbury. In 1817, 7 years after Blackburn had moved to Franklin, the ABC-FM sent Cyrus Kingsbury to the exact region where Blackburn had been. Now, Kingsbury wanted to establish a self-sustaining community among the Native Americans. He only found a few dilapidated buildings and a grist mill. So, along with other missionaries and some Native Americans, he constructed a school, a sawmill, a blacksmith shop, a smokehouse, a corn crib, a church, of course, and stables, in addition to dwellings for the missionaries. Kingsbury named this the Brainerd Mission. It was named for David Brainerd, who was a Presbyterian missionary to Native Americans the previous century in the mid-Atlantic region. Okay. Now, in the school here, the Native Americans learned basic English, arithmetic, religion, of course. And since Kingsbury wanted these missions to be self-sustaining, education in manual skills often actually supplanted the 3 R's. Now, 2 years later, in 1819, President James Monroe visits Brainerd. What brings the President of the United States to a Presbyterian Missionary Society area, southeastern Tennessee? It was a long trip then. Monroe wanted to see for himself the self-sustaining community, but more importantly, the way in which Native Americans were being educated. And he concluded that the manual skills was the best way not only to Christianize Native Americans, but also to civilize and acclimate them. And this also meshed well with a piece of legislation that had just been passed by Congress, the Civilization Fund Act. It provided support for missionaries and other benevolent societies for Native Americans. Federal money with the Civilization Fund Act providing financial support. Well, now Congress was a lot more interested in the civilizing part than the Christianizing part, and they were hopeful that the missionaries could then help pave the way so that Native Americans would see that the best way of surviving was by moving west. Now, Kingsbury obviously had excellent organizational skills. Just a couple of years after establishing the Brainerd Mission, he was sent by the ABCFM to Mississippi, where he established two other very similar missions. He established the Elliott Mission and the Mayhew Mission among the Choctaw. Okay. And he lived with them. Now, living with the Choctaw, he had come to respect them, and they also respected him. They knew that he had come to stay, not just to pass through. And so in 1820, when the Choctaw had to meet with federal agents concerning a land cession, they asked Kingsbury to go with them, and he agreed. Kingsbury was horrified by the way in which the Native Americans were treated by these federal agents. He, in fact, advised them to withdraw from the cession until they were taken more seriously, which they did. And this particular negotiation turned out much better for the Choctaw than one might have expected. But it was at this point that Kingsbury realized that he and other missionaries were, to the government, just pawns. The government was supporting them, hoping that they would help convince Native Americans to move out of these territories in Georgia and Mississippi. Kingsbury decided he would help the Choctaw resist removal. So he renewed his efforts at acculturation through education. He tried to encourage a more sedentary lifestyle, hoping that this would dispel the notion that Native Americans were inferior. Ultimately, of course, we know that Kingsbury was not successful. 10 years later, he was asked again by the Choctaw to go to yet another meeting about yet more land cessions. This time the federal agents were ready for him. They met him before they even arrived at the location, and Kingsbury was told, missionaries are not welcome. And so this particular negotiation turned out quite differently. As we know, no Native Americans were successful in retaining their homelands. The push westward, the desire for land, the desire for resources was simply too strong, and they could not resist it. The Cherokee tried even through the Supreme Court. They had developed a language. They took a lawsuit to the Supreme Court. And in 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinion of the court that the Cherokee could not be forcibly removed. President Andrew Jackson chose to ignore that decision, and the troops removed the Native Americans. Okay. The Choctaw were actually the first of the southeastern tribes to be forcibly removed to Oklahoma Territory. Cyrus Kingsbury went with them, along with other missionaries who also accompanied them on the trek. And so his purpose changed a bit, from one of helping Native Americans resist removal to one of supporting them in Oklahoma. Now, given that the land they received in Oklahoma was hardly the equivalent of what they had ceded in Mississippi, this was quite a challenge. He worked diligently to establish schools, churches, and when the Chickasaw arrived, with no missionaries having come with them, they too were able to be a part of the organizational structure and adapt what Kingsbury had done for the Choctaw. Now, schools were crucial to Kingsbury's vision, and he wasted no time working with the Choctaw to open both boarding schools and local day schools. In 1842, this is less than a decade after the Choctaw have been removed, their tribal council authorized 6 boarding schools and a number of other day schools. Predating even this authorization was the establishment of a really important institution, the Goodland Mission. It was begun in 1835, and it did include a small school. But despite all odds, from then until today, as we shall see, the Goodland Mission survived, although its purpose changed. In the 1850s, the Presbyterian Church and the ABCFM actually sent people just to be in charge of the Goodland School. But this was the 1850s, and then came the American Civil War. It was a very trying time for both missions and Native Americans. The ABCFM opposed slavery, and it announced that it would cease to support any mission among tribes that did not renounce slavery. Some Choctaw owned slaves, and when the tribal council did not denounce slavery, the ABCFM cut off its financial support to Kingsbury's mission. Now, to make matters a little worse, shortly after that, the Presbyterian Church, which had also been a part of this, split north and south. In September of 1861, the Oklahoma Presbytery then voted to align with the Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States of America. Kingsbury actually attended the first General Assembly. That was in Atlanta. And he took with him a product of his own schooling system, a man named Allen Wright. Allen Wright was a full-blooded Choctaw. He had benefited from Kingsbury's education. He had graduated from Union Theological Seminary in New York. And he would become chief of the Choctaw Nation. After the Civil War, if it's possible, things were even worse. Okay. The ABCFM was no support. The Presbyterian Church still split north and south, had other things on its mind than supporting the tribes in Oklahoma. Allen Wright had a few tribal funds that he could use to provide support, but the bottom line is some of the churches and some of the schools simply ceased to exist. Following Kingsbury's death in 1870, the effort as a whole really lacked a unifying force, and so it became strictly up to Oklahoma Presbytery to support the churches and the schools. And you can imagine the resources that Oklahoma Presbytery did not have. Fortunately, one man stepped in to help with the Goodland in particular, and that was John Turnbull. He was also a Choctaw minister, a Choctaw Supreme Court judge, national treasurer for the tribe, and superintendent of the Choctaw tribal schools. He took this under his wing for 20 years. Finally, in 1890, PCUSA assigned Joseph Gibbons to come and supervise Goodland Academy. Then it became the responsibility on the Committee of Home Missions. A residence hall was built, and the Goodland Mission School becomes the Goodland Indian Orphanage. And it continues to operate today. no longer as the Goodland Indian Orphanage, but as the Goodland Academy, which is a residential facility for boys and a school for all local students. There were, of course, many more missionaries. We focused on Blackburn and Cyrus Kingsbury today so that you could get some idea of the complexity of these individuals as they went about their work with Native Americans. Okay. Some, like Kingsbury, went to Oklahoma. Others, like Thomas Stewart, did not travel to Oklahoma. He was commissioned by the Presbytery of South Carolina in 1820 to minister to the Chickasaw in Mississippi, which he did. When the Chickasaw were removed to Oklahoma, Stewart stayed in Mississippi. He continued to establish churches there, over 5 after removal. And in this area where Stewart started, you have the birth of current-day Tombigbee Presbytery. Okay. So as we examine the work of these early missionaries, we can see not only their impact on their own time, but also their impact on the future, which is our present. For our next webinar, please join me as we explore the Presbyterian mission to the Dakota in Minnesota, and then as they move on to the northern Great Plains. Our reason for this whole exhibit is to tell the broad story of Presbyterian missions, not just to North America, not just to the Native Americans in the South, but throughout the United States. So as we follow the Dakota from Minnesota to North and South Dakota, we will go to, among other places, Wounded Knee, which housed one of the major Presbyterian missions in the area. Not sure you've ever heard of Wounded Knee? Well, tune in next week.